Now for today's program. Nina Totenberg is NPR's award-winning legal affairs correspondent. She is the author of the forthcoming book, Dinners with Ruth, a memoir on the power of friendship, which chronicles her nearly 50-year friendship with the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Nadine Epstein is editor-in-chief and CEO of Moment Magazine. Her most recent book is RBG's Brave and Brilliant Women, 33 Jewish Women to Inspire Everyone, written in collaboration with the late Supreme Court Justice during the last year of her life. Without further ado, please welcome Nina Totenberg and Nadine Epstein.
So usually on Justice Ginsburg's birthday, I always sent her, I like to send her like sweets. Like I always felt, in the years that I knew her, she was very, very slim. And I always sent her chocolate candy and cake along with a card. So that was my annual way to celebrate her birthday for her. And I just thought today, since it's March 15th and she would be 89, that it would be very special for us to get together and just remember some stories about her and some of just what she was like as a person. And so Nina here actually has knew her for way, way longer than I did. I met her in 2014. And that was when I did an interview of her in her office. And then we started talking and we became friends. But Nina met her. Nina, tell us about when you met her.
Oh, I met her when I was almost literally a babe in arms in terms of Supreme Court coverage. I got assigned to cover the Supreme Court, and I really didn't know what I was doing. And I called her up, and I've told this story many times. I called her up because she had filed a brief in a case called Reed v. Reed, which would ultimately become the first case in which the Supreme Court said that you couldn't arbitrarily discriminate against women based on their gender. And the argument she made was that women were protected by the equal protection of the law guaranteed by the Constitution. And of course, that's the 14th Amendment, which was enacted after the Civil War to protect not women really at the time, because we didn't even have the right to vote, but slaves, people who'd been enslaved, and African Americans. And so I didn't understand how this could be. And I called her up and I got an hour-long lecture. And in the end, it boiled down to the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, protects all people, and women are people.
So it was a workaround, really, for what the Equal Rights Amendment. And so then you guys, you didn't meet her, that was a phone call. And eventually you met her at a conference or something?
Yeah, we sort of arranged to meet at this conference. I started calling her because she was accessible.
A great source.
She was young in those, she was in her, I think, probably late 30s. And I was in my middle, maybe early-ish 20s. And she was accessible. If you called her, she picked up her own phone. She talked to me. And when I didn't understand something, I would ask her about it. And I had other people I treated that way. There's something about youth that is incredibly emboldening. I mean, I would call up quite famous judges and say, I really don't understand this part of your opinion. Could you explain it to me? And nobody ever said no.
That's great. That's how you learn. That's what reporters do. That's how you learn.
So we arranged to meet at this conference. It might have been at Columbia, it might have been at NYU, but I think it was about arbitration, and it was very boring. She thought it was about something else, and normally I would defer to her memory, but because I was so overwhelmed by everything I was learning and meeting her at this event, I think it probably was arbitration. In any event, it was incredibly boring, and we left and went shopping.
Where'd you go shopping?
I don't remember. I only really remember the cab ride and how how interesting it was and how wonderful to talk to her.
Because we talked about, she always had, she dressed so beautifully, and she had such an artistic eye for art, for music, for everything. I mean, but her clothes were so beautiful. And once I asked her, where did she get all these, she always wore these beautiful kind of tunic-like jackets. And I was, where do you, like, what store are they from? Because I don't see them anywhere. And she told me that she bought them in Santa Fe. She always, every year she went to the Santa Fe Opera, and there was a boutique there, and that she always went to this boutique and she always bought something there. And she would she often, like at different events I'd see her, she would wear this, she turned through her closet, do these beautiful, beautiful things. So had you gone shopping with her other times, or was that the only time you guys went shopping?
Because I think Ruth really shopped when she had the time. Yeah. And when she had the time was usually when she was at events, which were at, for example, a fancy resort where there would be a clothing store that was quite nice. And because she was a size 2, or maybe in her fatter periods, maybe she was a 4, but
3.
I think, she could wear everything. Nothing had to be altered. And one of my favorite things she bought when I was with her once, at the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals Judicial Conference. And it was at this fancy resort in Colorado Springs. I think it was in Colorado Springs. And I can't remember the name of the resort. It's famous and it's fancy. And she went to the store and I went with her. And of course, there was nothing in my size. I mean, she's a 2, I'm a 12, right? No, there was nothing in my size. I didn't even bother to try on anything that it all would have looked just dreadful on me. But she picked out this beautiful black and white jacket that had sort of different, it looked like a bird almost. It was like the feathers of a bird, but it was material, cut out material. So it'd be a white piece of material, a black piece of material laid over, and she loved it, and she was correct to love it. She looked like $1 million in it, and she would wear it with black flowing pants, and she wore it and she wore it and she wore it to death. And I was just on the verge of, a few years before her death, wondering, could I tell her that
Stop wearing it,
getting yellow, it was no longer white? And then finally one day, I had not seen it for for a couple of months. And I said, Ruth, what happened to your black and white jacket? She said, it was falling apart. I couldn't wear it anymore. I had to retire it.
Did she ever, when I talked to her, she was usually very serious. And we had a lot of serious conversations, including advice about my life and projects we were working on. And she actually had me working on a number of projects. Like she wanted me to, I helped her with a few things, but she didn't crack a lot of jokes. That wasn't her style. And I was wondering, did she ever do anything like that was really funny or make you laugh?
Well, she always made me laugh because she giggled, but she liked other people to tell funny stories and to tell jokes, and she would love them, and she would laugh very hard at them. The only thing that I know that she used to tell gossip. And when she told gossip or got gossip, she would giggle while she was telling it. And so, but she wasn't somebody who told jokes. That was Marty. Marty was the joke teller with perfect timing. Or her friend Nino, Justice Scalia, who had absolutely the best. He, in another life, could have been a stand-up comic. His timing was so perfect. And that's one of the reasons she loved him, is that he was funny.
So people around her were funny, and she was the, what was it called? The serious. She
was the straight woman.
The straight woman. Yeah, she was the straight woman. Yeah. Was Marty as wonderful as described? I only met Marty once, and I was just standing there next to him. We didn't even converse really. Was he as wonderful as described? And what were they like as a couple?
As described, and he was, if anything, he was a little hard on himself. He in one or two of the speeches he gave, he looked back on his the earlier years of their marriage and thought that he wasn't gracious enough, because he was, of course, trying to make partner in a law firm and et cetera, et cetera. And I think he thought that, looking back on it, he was not as supportive as he could have been. But I never saw a moment of that, and I never heard a moment of that from her either. So I assumed that he was harder on himself than anybody else was. And he was a very funny man. My experience is that tax lawyers are very funny people. It's sort of counterintuitive, but most of my late husband was a tax lawyer, and while he wasn't hilarious, he was funny when he was funny, but he knew all of the leading tax lawyers and the people who were head of the IRS and head of the tax section of this and the tax section of that. And he had been on the finance committee when he was in the
Floyd
Senate.
Haskell. Yeah.
Yeah. My husband was Floyd Haskell, and he was in the Senate for one term, and he was on the finance committee. So he knew all those tax people, and he'd been a tax lawyer himself. And I got to know all those people. And what always struck me was how terribly funny they were. They were a riot.
Yeah.
And so and Marty Ginsburg was very funny.
I mean, he was such a special man for his era. I mean, the one woman that Justice Ginsburg and I we were like disagreed about was, in the book when we did, was Betty Friedan. And that was simply because my world, women really, the suburban world that I grew up in New Jersey, women were, exactly fit the stereotype of the feminine mystique. But Justice Ginsburg grew up in New York, and then also was in Harvard, and then she was in Columbia, then she's in Washington, D.C., and then she was married to like one of the nicest men of the world, who was so supportive of her. So she didn't really have that experience that like my mom did, for example, So he just seems amazing. When did you discover that Justice Ginsburg didn't know how to use her oven at the Watergate?
When did I discover what?
I read an article, and you wrote about how you discovered you and your current husband, David,
Mm-hmm.
who is her doctor, one of her doctors. You went there, and you both discovered that she didn't know how to use her oven in her apartment.
So this was when Marty was quite sick, near the end of his life. And I called up to see if we could bring something over for dinner or something like that. And she said, oh, no, that's not necessary at all. And then I don't know why, but I said, would you like me to come over? Would you like David to take a look at Marty? And we arrived at the apartment, and obviously she'd been up most of the night with him. And it had been a very trying evening. And David went upstairs to examine Marty and to talk to him, and then came down afterwards. And he said that he said to her, you need help here. You can't do this all yourself. He said to her, most precisely, I have Medicaid patients who have more help than you do. So, anyway, I had brought over this artichoke souffle thing that I had bought at the outdoor market near our house. And it was in a tin, in an aluminum tin. And all you had to do was heat it up for half an hour or whatever it was. And I said to her, Ruth, why don't I leave this here? She said, oh, that's a good idea. And I said, all you have to do is warm it up. And she said, yeah, I'll put it in the microwave. I said, no, if you do that, you'll short out everything in the apartment.
Because of fire.
Metal, you don't put metal in the microwave. And she said, so I put it in the oven. And I said, yes, that's what you do. And I turned to leave, and David, God bless him, said, Ruth, do you know how to turn on your oven? And the wonderful Ruth Bader Ginsburg admitted rather candidly that she did not. And he gave her lessons in how to operate her oven, how to turn it on, how to set it before you put something in, how to leave it. And then he made her do it in front of him several times to make sure that she had it down.
Wow, that's amazing. did she ever give you advice? She gave me some advice, and I'm just wondering, did she give you advice along the way, or did you ever ask her for advice?
I asked her for advice occasionally, but mainly the best advice she ever gave me, I wrote about at the time she died. It was when my late husband was terribly ill for a very long time, for years. But in the beginning, it was a siege, and I was semi-living at the hospital, and she said to me, you can't do this. You're not doing him any favors, and you're not doing yourself any favors. You need to go and see him and spend an hour with him and make sure he's being properly taken care of. And then you need to go to work and do your work. It may not be the best work you've ever done, but it'll be good enough, and you will be able to stay who you are, so that when he comes home, you are the person he's always known and are there to take care of him when he needs it most. And it was just the best advice anybody ever gave me.
That's really caring advice. She gave me advice because one time, well, sometimes, like, I never actually asked for advice, but one time I told her that I didn't like speaking in public, and I liked being a journalist because I was kind of behind the scenes, and that was fine. I didn't need to be up on stage. I didn't need to be really sharing my mind. And she bit my head off. She said, "Get over it." She said, "If you don't speak your mind, no one's going to speak it for you." And I just went, and I don't even know why I said that to her, because we were just talking and it just kind of came out. And she, was like, she was a very reticent person by nature. And then she told me the whole long story, which she told me several times before, about how, when she was in her first year of law school, Anthony Lewis was in her class, and he had already been like Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times reporter. And she was terrified to speak up in class because he was just so smart. And of course, she was so smart too, and how she really had to force herself to do it. So I was like advice that I really took to heart, and I completely changed my ways.
She was not a fan of hiding your light under a bushel. I
No.
mean, that was not her way. She was a performer. She was very shy.
Yes.
That is true. And she was not somebody for easy chit chat. You had to work at it. But she really, if she was performing, if she was giving a speech, if she was on the stage, as anybody knows who's ever seen her on the stage, she was not reticent. She had learned to be a performer.
Yes. And she actually really appreciated your warmth. Like, she wasn't really super warm in like she didn't come and meet you. Maybe she did with you, but she didn't call me dear or darling, or, like, that wasn't her style. But she had a real warmth to her. And she also really empowered, like, I felt like she empowered other women. I didn't really think about it at the time, but even when we honored her in 2019, she gave a speech. Actually, of course, we brought up Nina to interview her so that she didn't have to give a speech.
And I told her that I might not make it because Cokie was dying. My darling friend Cokie was dying.
Yeah.
And I needed to get back. But I did make it. But she'd already written a speech. So I interviewed her and she gave a speech.
Yeah. And at the end of that speech, then she also said something really nice. She said something really nice about me. She always was very, that kind of took me by surprise, because I didn't really, she sort of shared, I actually had this conversation with Lauren Holtzblatt a little bit, who's her rabbi, who became her rabbi, that she kind of shared her power with younger women. She wanted you to be, she brought you out of yourself without saying that that's what she was going to do. And that was something really meaningful. So she did definitely not want you to be like hiding behind your, like, so I guess when I said, "Oh, I don't like to do this," her immediate reaction was just really strong. And she didn't couch it in like a really, like, she didn't say, "Oh, well, dear, you should do this." She was just like, "Get over it." And
So Nadine, I want to ask you a question.
okay.
So when you worked on this book with her, which was really quite near the end of her life, it was in 2020. Is that when you were working on it?
We started talking about the book in October 2019 in her chambers, because she had given this speech at the event where we honored her, where she was, by the way, just so happy. And that was it was a very lovely evening. And we were talking about her speech. And then that's when the book just happened. So yes, we started talking about the book in October of 2019. It's like 11 months from when she died. And then we were like discussing it and corresponding. And also this is then prime COVID happens. Like this is all, I'm not seeing her, by the way, we're doing all this by email mostly.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, so it was hard. It was really hard. So we were doing this, the last year of her life. So what was the question?
How much did she edit what you wrote?
Ooh, you knew what question to ask there. So, so of course, originally she was writing the introduction, and then we chose the women together, and these women were mostly really important women to her. It never crossed my mind that she was going to want to read the whole book, because I was writing the bios and I just assumed she was really busy, and she was really busy. And so so in July of 2020, like I finally I rented a cabin to spend 2 weeks to start working on the bios. The day I arrive at the cabin, I get an email from her which says, "Hi, I'm ready to look at the book now." And and I was like, "What?" And she said, and she explained, she goes, "Well, I have to start with this. I have a little break in time now." Now, she didn't talk about that she was sick or anything. I mean, I knew she was sick, but because in August, I have to prepare for the new term of the Supreme Court. So this is my time to go over the book with you. So I spent one of the least fun 2 weeks of my life trying to put together like a really quick draft of as many bios as I could. And I sent them to her. So what do I get back? I got back 150 pages, I don't know how many pages, a lot of pages of extensive notes and markouts on like every page. And no, you haven't thought this through. This wrong word. I mean, and my just so edited. And she had told me ahead of time, she goes, all your work is really good. I'm so delighted to be working on this. Your writing is beautiful. So my first reaction was just shame, because I was like, I've disappointed Justice Ginsburg, and look at all these comments. Later on, I realized that she just edited me the way she edited a law clerk. Everybody. But then my second reaction was, though, after I cried for a few minutes, was that I actually learned about her from every single comment that she made. I learned, it's like a window into her mind and how she was thinking and why she thought about things the way she did. So it was really interesting. And so I
like
learned
what?
a lot.
Like what?
Well, let's look at the Betty Friedan. So the one she really disagreed, I wrote something about Betty Friedan, and I explained that Betty Friedan was very important for women of her era, how the feminine mystique, about how women viewed themselves. And she crossed it out. And I just couldn't understand why. And so she basically explained that really she wasn't that important to urban women, and she really wasn't that important to women of color, which is very true. But of course, I grew up in the suburbs in New Jersey, and my mom, I read The Feminine Mystique when I was like 12 because it was sitting on the bookshelf. And every single woman I knew in our neighborhood was living the life of, a woman who had something amazing going on in their lives, and they had given it all up so that they could have 4 children, and they were living in the suburbs surrounded by piles of laundry. And so for me, it was way more, I thought of her as much more important, but it was really interesting. And then also Justice Ginsburg had Marty Ginsburg, who was a pretty unique man for his era. So by just learning, by realizing what her opinion was about Betty Friedan, I got to see more into her life, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. It does.
She also had, I was trying to make the some of the language kind of chattier, and she wasn't a chatty.
No, she was not a chatty Cathy.
She
And
put,
one of the beauties of
Yeah.
her work, and it got better and better and better over the years, was to read her opinions and her dissents, and even in some very complicated areas, especially the dissents, and see how spare her language is, how incredibly careful every word is, how each one means something, and how she didn't write 100-page opinions, nothing like that, or 50-page opinions.
She took her emotion out of it.
A dissent was 6 pages long, but it was so clear what her objection was that almost anybody with a half a brain would have understood it.
And she took out like the emotion too. Like she was, I think once she had told me, I mean, I think she did this in her arguments as well, but she didn't load her comments with emotion. They were very straightforward. And so she did a lot of marking, like she used the word like women gained, women earned. It was interesting that she took out, I hadn't put a lot of emotion into the book, but I had a little bit, and she took it all out. So she didn't get to see the final draft, of course, because she was doing this in July of 2020. And then even in August, she was also, by the way, sending me more women that she thought should be in the book, like end of July and August. And then we also interviewed her in August for another project we were doing at Moment, and which brings me to this is like, I was only communicating with her by emails really at this point. You were actually having dinners with her during the lockdown. Tell us a little bit about
well, because she'd been my friend for so long, almost 50 years, and because and I know that she had millions of other friendships that I don't even know about that may have been closer at some point. But in that last year of her life, because she was so trusted me and trusted my husband and could discuss what was going on with her physically without discussing that in front of me, they would literally disappear sometimes into the powder room.
Really?
But she had no place else where she could go. She would have been on lockdown in her own apartment, never leaving to so much as go to go out to a grocery store. She wouldn't have seen the outside world at all. Her children were wonderful. Jane, her daughter, came, I think, basically decamped most of the time to Washington. And her husband would come sometimes too. And her granddaughter, Clara, would come sometimes. And her son, James, would have to drive because he'd have to get tested and then drive without essentially stopping from Chicago to Washington. And so he didn't come as often, but he did come, as did his wife a couple of times. And whoever was there would come to dinner with her. And she came almost every Saturday. I think David counted, I think he thinks that he cooked somewhere between 23 and 26 meals for her, because he was a wonderful cook, like Marty, maybe not quite as good as Marty, because Marty could bake. David doesn't do baking. And we would just have her for dinner. And occasionally she was alone and the detail would just bring her. But most of the time, especially as she got frailer, there was some member of her family there always in that last few months. And they would come and my job was to entertain her. David's was to feed her. And I would leave sometimes a message on her voicemail, and it would say something like, would you like to have swordfish or snapper or bouillabaisse? And invariably, if I gave her that choice, the phone would ring at some point that afternoon, and this voice would say, bouillabaisse, of course. So, you know, in the end, she was very frail and very determined, but it was pretty clear that she was losing the battle. And the question was only how long she could hold out. You know, there was a month that we were apart in August. And that was because we were on vacation. And I had written all of the obituary pieces in advance, just in case, so that they could get slapped on the digital page and on the air, and I would then come back immediately. But, and I watched a tribute to Judge Katzman, the chief judge of the Second Circuit, who has since died, but there was a tribute to him, and she did they filmed her, some film crew, I think, or else that it was a Zoom call, I'm really not sure, but there was a video of her talking about him. And I could see how much weight she had lost in just the weeks I hadn't seen her. I think it was towards the end of August, and she was holding this shawl away from her body so that we viewers wouldn't notice how thin she was, but I knew how thin she was. So when I got back, I think we basically brought dinner to her almost from then on until about 10 days before she died, I think, or a week. I think it was a week before she died, we brought dinner over there. She might have come one more time to the house, but by then, she was not, I don't know how she went up our front stairs. There are 6 big stairs, and towards the end, her detail, which was mainly female, Heather or one of the other folks who were with her she would come up that stairway holding on one side, and the detail person would have her arm completely around her, holding on to her so that she couldn't fall.
So when was the last time she was over at your house? Do you remember when that was?
I don't know when was the last time she was
September
at our house. The last meal I had with her was in September at her apartment, and it was bouillabaisse. We brought bouillabaisse for dinner, and she was so tired that she kept falling asleep with the fork in her hand. And every time her daughter Jane would say, Mom, you're tired, she'd say, no, I want to eat my bouillabaisse. And then she'd talk for a minute and listen, and then she'd be sitting there with her. Finally, I said to her, Ruth, you have to go upstairs. We'll save the bouillabaisse for you for tomorrow. And Jane and David took her upstairs.
She always loved to finish all her meals. I only had dinner with her a few times, and sometimes they were mostly in public places, but she ate very slowly, but she really had that era of maybe being born in 1933. She ate every bite on her plate. And I always felt the need to, and actually at that, when we honored her, there were so many people all around her that I was actually standing over her like this to keep her so she could eat her meal.
Right.
Because I knew she wanted to eat her meal. And she was, at this point, this is 2019, every person in the room, and there were maybe 300 people in the room, wanted to take a photo with her. And I was just
can't let that happen.
No,
we never let that happen. That was one thing. David was her guard, and he would say no photos, because if you allow one, there's no stopping it. So that whenever we were at a big gala or something like that with her, and people wanted to come take pictures, he would say no photos. And he would say, can you, or he'd say, he would always say no photos, and then he'd say, come back when she's finished her eating.
Yes, that's what I said. I did that.
Yeah.
And she actually, I think, enjoyed doing some of the photos because there was something about her that did love, like it really meant a lot to her, the interaction that she had with people. Like it fed her in some way, especially in the last, at least the years that I knew her.
Oh, I think it did, but photos were, for
Too
some
much.
stranger, was a little odd. But I
Yeah.
never did figure out why or how she ate so slowly, because she always finished, and you're quite right, she ate every morsel on her plate. And she is, after all, Jewish. She was, after all, Jewish. I don't know any Jewish person who eats slowly, much less that slowly.
Well, it's a good question. I don't know. But my dad ate that way, actually. So, and he was from Brooklyn, and he was the same era as Justice Ginsburg. So maybe there was something about the Depression era. I mean, my dad was a little bit older, but just that the way he was taught to eat. So where were you when you heard that she died? Like, you were back from vacation? You were home? We were.
I was home.
Mhm.
And I, and Jane called and told me. And
Okay.
so, and I knew, she said there'll be something out of the press office in a half an hour or so. So I told it, I called my editor and I said, get ready to push the button.
So you knew for a couple months that this was really coming, that she
Well,
was
I just didn't
really.
know, at some level, you don't want to know that she's going to die. I mean, I
Yeah.
knew she was going to die. I just didn't know. And
that-
I kept thinking that maybe it could be staved off for a year or 6 more months. And clearly my husband, who never, he's a HIPAA Nazi. So he never told me anything about what was going on with her that I couldn't observe for myself. But he clearly thought the end was very near.
because in my
For longer than I did. I mean,
really,
she lasted longer than he thought she would.
because she wrote me a little note about how they were always very forward focused emails. It was like,
Listen,
we're going
on
to do this.
that last dinner I had with her, she said, I thought last week I was going to die, but I'm not going to die.
Good. Okay. So she really believed like she was gonna, like, that was just my feeling, is that this was a surprise to her in a
I
way,
think
that
that's
she
right.
thought she thought she had more time
I
than
think
she
so. And,
did.
some people, my dad was like that. When he was towards the end of his life, we figured we'd better get some hospice in for him. And when we talked to the hospice nurse, I said, do not say the words end of life to him or death,
Yeah.
because then we will be dead. You will have to pick up the pieces because we will be dead.
Well, she actually used the word to me, staving. She goes, it's hard staving off cancer, but I have a lot to do. And so that was just it was like something, one of the things she was doing was just staving off cancer. And again,
And she'd done it for almost all of her adult, at least from the time she was about, when she was in her 60s on.
And she staved off Marty's cancer.
And she'd staved off Marty's cancer for a long
so
time.
so it was just something. So of course just from the emails and things that she sent me, and even in like this is so, even in, again, to me, in August, I asked her to be we were doing a symposium about what is it that would make, I can't remember, the world better. I can't remember exactly what it was. It was some important question, and she wanted to answer it. And so she had sent me more ideas. So she was actually on email and thinking, and
the thing is that a lot of people, most people, I suspect, when they are terribly ill and old, and because she was not young, their brains are not, it's not that they necessarily have dementia or anything, but their brains are not what they once were. And the astonishing thing to me about Ruth was that while her body was just pooping out on her, her brain never did.
It didn't. No.
Not for one instant.
Yeah.
You know, I may forget Nadine, what's her last name? Oh yeah, Epstein, not Ruth. No, nothing like that.
Yes, she was very, very fortunate in that way. She really was, because that doesn't happen to everyone.
No, it happens to almost nobody. She had the brain of, you know, somebody in their 40s. She just had not dropped a stitch. She got tired. Yes, she did get tired. And she didn't do as much in the end of court work as she would have done otherwise. But she knew what she had to do.
But I feel like she actually did her homework so well. She overdid her homework. She overcompensated as a woman. That was always my feeling. Like, she was talking in July about how she had to get prepared for the term, and it was going to take her a whole month to read everything. And, you know, I was thinking, you know, you've been doing this for a really long time. I just felt like she just had this habit of overworking in a way.
Well, I think that was the way she had conducted her life. Yeah. Always. From the time, you know, it was what her mother expected of her in her studies. It was what she expected of herself as a scholarship student at Cornell. It was what she expected of herself at Harvard in order to survive there, and then to take care of Marty when he had testicular cancer and she was taking care of a toddler, taking care of him, and was on law review. This is just the way, this was her MO.
Yes.
And I don't think that people drop their MOs as they get older. I think that's, unless you want to do something very different. And she didn't. She wanted to do this. Yes. This is what was important to her.
Yes. It's also one of the things that kept her alive so long. I mean, I think that having this passion for the law and for her position and the Supreme Court was like, you know, and also the other thing was her love of being out in the world. She loved, like, I only really became part of her life after 2014. But she was going to so many events, and she loved being, she wasn't like, again, she wasn't the talk of the table. She wasn't the person who was telling the jokes, but she was beaming at the table. She loved it.
You know, she did love it, but I think some of that was keeping herself alive after Marty died. You know, he was so much the life of the party and such a great partner. And they did so many things together that when he died, I think that she very consciously stepped up her game as being at a dinner table. And she also would very consciously started accepting more invitations to gala events, to people's homes, to even to help with a book, of all kinds of things where she might not have done that if he were alive and entertaining her, but he wasn't. Yes. And she knew she needed that outside stimulus, that world stimulus, so to speak.
I remember, and I actually want to ask a couple more questions, and then we have actual questions, but I was just going to tell one story. In 2014, we honored Theodore Bickel, the actor and the musician, and we had his 90th birthday party, and it was here in DC. And I always invited Justice Ginsburg to come to these events, and she never had showed up at any of them, but she showed up, and she adored Theodore Bickel. I mean, she adored music, and she had actually met him once she and Marty had gone backstage after he'd performed somewhere. And she was so excited to meet him and talked so much to Theodore Bickel. And finally, Marty pulled her away and said, I think we need to go now. And so she told me this story, and then Theo told me this story. And then when they re-met, she just, after the performance was over, after the gala was over, Justice Ginsburg got up on stage and sat next to Theodore Bickel and was just so excited to just be there with him. And you could just see the joy, and it was like they reunited. But it was really a wonderful moment. I have great pictures of them just totally involved, talking to each other. So a couple quick questions here, and they're not really such easy questions, but I guess, what do you think is the most important thing to remember about Justice Ginsburg, if there's one thing that just pops into your mind?
Well, for women of my generation, and I'm older than you are by a fair amount, for women of my generation, I probably wouldn't be sitting here without her. I mean, she changed the way the world is for people of my generation, for women, and made a possibility for us to have professional lives. And that is, I never forgot that.
Okay. And then I'm just wondering, what if there's one issue that she'd want women, or just people, Americans, to be thinking about today? Is there something that that she'd like us to be focusing on? And I'm not saying put ideas, I'm just thinking about, like, what was maybe the most important thing for her that she'd be wanting us to do now, in terms of, and maybe the question is this: gender equity meant a huge amount to her. And this is something I think a lot about, because I've just done this book with her, and it's a big part of it. It's about gender equity and the women who led the way to gender equity, including Justice Ginsburg. But what do you think is the best way for us to gender equity at this point in the United States?
Well, it's a complicated question, and I may not be the best person to answer this, because, if you go to any workplace in America, professional workplace in America, you will find that the views of the older women are quite different from the views of the younger women. And I am vigilant about protecting women's access to the workplace and to jobs that go all the way up the ladder, and to protecting women from sexual harassment, etc. But I worry, and this I think comes from having lived through this, a period of time when women had no mentors, because men had no interest in being their mentors most of the time, and also because, frankly, if people will talk. People will talk if you have a male mentor, if I'm helping you, if I'm taking you out on the road with me as my junior partner. And I worry that if we get so on our high horses that we make men afraid of us, in a sense, we will lose something very important. And I don't think younger women see things that way, because they've never experienced the alternative to the way they live now. And they may be way more right than I am. I may be fearful, or I may be wise. I'm really not sure.
So you're saying that you're like the kind of struggle for gender equity is really turn off men? Because, like, from my perspective, there are so many men who now value this, and it's there's such an important kind of pillar of democracy what the change has been is that so many men are much more aware of it. But what I find is that, so, like, a lot of young people, and even not so, just people of all ages, are so simply not aware that we really don't have gender equity in this country. At this point, we don't have legal gender equity, and we have a lot of fires to put out but we don't really have a clear strategy for getting gender equity in the Constitution. And that concerns me a lot.
Well, it concerned her too. But she did think that you couldn't revive the Equal Rights Amendment and get it passed by getting some states to change their votes or whatever. And I think she was right. So I think that, part of I actually am less worried than you are. I think that we have done pretty well and we will continue to do well. And if you see, for example, at the moment, there is this enormous push and concern about the fact that there aren't enough people to fill jobs. It's not just that, and the reason there aren't enough people to fill jobs is because women went home and they're not as much going back to the office. Now, I have my own views about whether that's a wise thing to do or not, but I don't have small children at home. And this country can't do well economically without gender equity. And I think most larger corporations certainly understand that. And most larger employers certainly understand that. And if they don't, they will very quickly and very sadly for themselves.
Well, there's a lot more to talk about in gender equity, because I see, just from talking to people about the book that I collaborated on with Ruth, I've been talking to a lot of people, and I just realized how little people are thinking about, like, basically she believed that you needed to have a new amendment, and let us not call it the ERA. This is just me. Maybe we need to call it XYZ, but a new amendment that says the same thing, but we need to start the process all over again.
Yes.
And she felt very strongly about that. And
she did, actually, because she thought she was much more of my generation, or I much more of her generation. She had great fears for us losing what we have gained. And so that was the basis of her view, that we needed something that would protect us against the political whims of the day, so that there would be a part of the Constitution that said you can't do that.
So I feel really strongly with her, and I don't think it's a difference between age. I don't think it's like older women think this and younger women think this, and I just feel like it's something that we really haven't been thinking about. So Justice Ginsburg was a real long-term strategist, and she felt like we had all these workarounds, and we needed to not have a workaround. She would always say, well, why are we one of the few countries who don't have, an amendment or don't have this in our Constitution? Of course, as you and I know, that doesn't really make a difference, because on some level, you have countries that have clauses in their Constitution, and
they
women are treated terribly.
Pay no attention to them.
But here we are, the United States of America. Here we are, a democracy we want to strengthen. And then having that in the Constitution seems to be very, very important. And so I feel like one thing we really need to remember to do in memory of Justice Ginsburg is to kind of keep on that path and think about what that path is, because it's not clear to me what it is if we're, at this point. I know we have lots of questions, so hold on a second.
And you're going to have to, we're going to have to quit at 8:30 because my husband will kill me.
Well, I think we're here's Suzanne. Suzanne's going to help us with the questions. There's a lot of good questions.
Thank you both. I know people really enjoyed listening to your stories and memories. Someone would like to know, do you know if Justice Ginsburg had any heroes of her own, or those that she considered role models?
Well,
she had lots. I mean, as Nadine knows even better than I do the breadth of her role models. But one of her last acts was to fly out to Berkeley in the summer of 2020, I think, to do an event at Berkeley with one of her former law clerks. And the reason that she did it is that they had gotten the idea that they wanted, that perhaps if they did, you know, it was an interview thing, and that they could put together the interview with some of her favorite opinions and do a book, which Berkeley Press has done. And she would not agree to it unless they promised to publish the unpublished book by her dear friend, Herma Helke, the former dean at Berkeley, and I think, and one of the first tenured law professors in the country, who had written a book about the first 14 tenured law professors, female law professors in the country. There weren't 15 because Herma Helke didn't want to shine a light on herself. So Ruth's introduction to the book was about Herma Helke.
Yes.
But it didn't get published for one reason or another, and she thought that was a travesty. And by now, Herma Helke had died, and she wanted to make sure that it got published. So that was the deal. They could use this event and make a book out of it, but they had to find a way to publish Herma Helke's book too. And you know, it's a great story of female loyalty.
Also, somewhere in the last year of her life, she was in the documentary about Pauli Murray. So Pauli Murray is so important. Pauli Murray is actually, you know, really probably the person who came up with the idea of using the 14th Amendment. And Justice Ginsburg then helped plot the strategy to make that work. But Pauli Murray didn't get the kind of attention she deserved. And so you can see in this film, My Name is Pauli Murray film, you can see Justice Ginsburg looking very frail, you know, speaking in the film. So I don't know if it was the last year or when it was exactly, but she definitely really thought highly of Pauli Murray.
That has to have been significantly before the last year. Yeah,
okay.
Because they made the film, you know,
earlier.
Putting together a film. I'm going to just see if we can turn on the lights again. If you go over
we can see you
wall,
perfectly fine.
or run around and the lights turn on, because there we go. That's it.
They're moved. So there's that. And also we did this whole book about role models. I mean, she and I, this is how, so again, when I'm in her office in October of 2019, she's talking about the women who who sustained her throughout her life. And they were women like Henrietta Sold, who I hadn't really thought much about, but she read every biography of Henrietta Sold. And then and as I worked on that bio, I really realized what an amazing woman she was. But she was a role model, very much. She loved Emma Lazarus. She had a whole list of women who really inspired her throughout her life. And some of them were Jewish, and those ended up being the ones in the book, because at that particular point in her life, I think this book was somehow part of her personal Jewish journey. And she wanted to remember these Jewish women, but there were a lot of women who weren't Jewish who were her role models.
Someone would like to know, how did she feel about achieving kind of like a cult status, that she was nicknamed the notorious RBG? There were little girls dressing up as her for Halloween. What did she think? You know, there were action figures. What did she think about all of that?
Well, you know, I think she liked it, but she wasn't fat-headed about it at the same time. But I think she liked it, and I think that she thought it was a good thing that little girls could have a role model who was a person of the mind, not you know, I mean, she had enormous respect for women who were athletes and who were had all other kinds of accomplishments, but hers was an accomplishment of the mind. And to have that as something that you could admire and seek to emulate, I think was important to her.
Mm-hmm.
I almost asked her that question, by the way, and she actually made a joke, which I wrote down. I mean, it was in a story I wrote, but I don't remember exactly what she said. But she said, "Well, I'd better be careful then, and not make any mistakes." That was basically that. She said it differently, but
how do you think she would think about the court today?
Well, it's not like she didn't see what was coming. I mean, after all, her last wish, which she had her granddaughter write down, was that her seat not be filled until after the election. And so she saw this from her perspective, train wreck coming, and she was not under any illusions.
Mhm. How was she as a grandmother?
She was a really good grandmother, and and in fact, one of my favorite stories from her granddaughter was, her granddaughter is the same size as Ruth, so she was always going into her closet and borrowing things to wear and then taking things to wear. And then one day she showed up, she came out of the closet wearing a coat, and she said, "I like this one very much." And Ruth looked up, and I guess she'd been doing this for, let's say a half an hour. "This looks great on me. This looks great on me." And then Ruth looks up and says, "I like that too, and I'm keeping it."
What was it about Justice Scalia that she was able to become such good friends with him off the bench?
Well, I think that, they had served together on the DC circuit. They met first at the University of Chicago when she was there, and she was absolutely charmed by his wit, and she loved that he made her laugh. But they had a lot of other reasons that they liked each other. They were both very serious about their work and treated it with enormous care and time. And he was a real grammarian, and he would sometimes correct her grammar, which she didn't particularly appreciate because she thought her grammar was just fine. But I think they had just so much respect for each other's work ethic and the way they approached their work that they could get over their very serious and sometimes, I assume, unpleasant differences. I mean, famously, he brought her his dissent in the Virginia Military Institute case before he circulated it to the rest of the court so that she could respond in her opinion. And she said it ruined her weekend. She was going to some event, judicial conference, and it ruined the weekend for her, but her opinion was far better because of it.
Mm-hmm. So we'll have time for one more question. Was there anything that was unfinished for her? Anything she was working on that she had hoped to complete before she passed?
Well, certainly the book that we were working on. She had, I think, wanted to be, it was for whatever reasons was very important to her, and she spent a lot of time on it. And, it would have been wonderful if she had been able to see it and, and continue to edit some of the other drafts of it. But I think that, that's just, it's a small thing in the world of things, but.
I always understood that I was just a small part of her life. She was a bigger part of mine, and she may have had something unfinished that she wanted to write or say or do, but I'm unaware of it if there was. And I think she felt actually she offloaded, as she put it, some of the dissent work towards the end of her life onto Justice Sotomayor, and felt badly about it because she knew she was not carrying her full weight. And so I think that probably was the only real regret she had in the last weeks of her life, that she assigned the dissents, and they were important to her, important to the other members of the court who agreed with her, but that she did not have the energy to write all of them that she would have otherwise taken for herself.
Mm-hmm. So, Well, I want to thank both of you for sharing these wonderful stories of Justice Ginsburg. And I want to remind everybody that Nina's book, Dinners with Ruth, is now available for pre-order. There's a link in the chat. And Nadine's book, RBG's Brave and Brilliant Women, is sold everywhere where books are sold. And if you want a signed copy, you can get that at momentmag.com. And I wanted to share one last thing before we leave tonight. I'm excited to announce that as part of Moment's role model project in memory of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, we're launching an essay contest for high school students. Students will select one of the women from the book and write a short essay about why the woman they selected inspires them. More information will be on our website, and I've put a link in the chat as well. And so we encourage anyone who has a high school student in their life to please submit an essay. And again, Nina and Nadine, thank you so much for joining us tonight, sharing these stories and celebrating what would have been
I want to just add one thing.
Please.
You should all buy Nadine's book. It's a wonderful book, and it's especially a wonderful book for young women and girls. And Ruth would have wanted you to.
And I think Nadine would say that she would want them to buy boys to read the book as well.
Yes, we went back to Ruth and talked to her about how the book should not just be for girls, should be for boys too, because boys need to read it as well. And most boys these days don't know that they shouldn't read it. So it turned out, so it's really important that it's for all genders, I think. So thank you.
Again, thank you
so much. Thank you so much, Nina. I learned so much, and it was lovely just to have a few minutes to talk about Ruth today.
It was very lovely.
And we look forward to reading your book as well.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Everyone.